a former colleague. As she read each line of the settlement aloud, the entire room fell silent. One question pierced everything. How many women walked into your office and didn't walk out whole? O'Reilly was speechless. In less than 5 minutes, the empire he had spent 30 years building collapsed live on national television. But what left all of America stunned was what she said next. Stay with us. This is a story worth every second of your time. It started with a leak, not gossip, not speculation, but a 42-page internal Fox News dossier labeled Confidential, Internal Use Only. It appeared on a whistleblower site at 3:14 a.m. Eastern. By sunrise, the whole country knew. Bill O'Reilly, once the most powerful voice in conservative media, had personally approved 6 secret settlements totaling over $45 million. The largest, $32 million, was paid to Liz Wheel, a legal analyst who had been a regular on his show, often introduced with a smile and the line, "A brilliant mind and a beautiful package." The leak hit the media like an explosion. Talk shows immediately reacted with outrage. Social media erupted with hashtags like #No More NDAs and O'Reilly Files. But the real shock wasn't just the money, it was the proof. O'Reilly's signature on every agreement and internal emails, in his own words, contain exposure, minimize disruption, critical asset protection. Fox News gave only one brief response. We are reviewing these documents. But by then, it was too late. The documents were verified, and the pressure on Congress to respond became impossible to ignore. For the first time in U.S. history, Congress called a public hearing, not just to investigate one man, but to expose how an entire media empire shielded him. This wasn't a private review or closed-door session. It was a full oversight committee hearing, broadcast live under oath, meant to answer one question. How many women were silenced so one man could stay on the air? The hearing wasn't sparked by a lawsuit. It was the scale, the money, the secrecy, the years of protection. Leading the questioning was Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett, a former civil rights attorney known for representing the unheard. She didn't chase headlines. She built cases. She didn't argue on Twitter. She filed motions. And now she'd face the man who once shaped national opinion until the truth reshaped him. 2 days before the hearing, Bill O'Reilly broke his silence with a late-night podcast. The lighting was harsh, his face close to the camera. No studio polish. I didn't do anything wrong, he said, his voice low and tight. I wasn't convicted. I was targeted. This isn't justice. It's politics. An attack by radicals who hate free speech. His hands never appeared. His tone never wavered. But the message landed flat. Within minutes, the video was everywhere. Analysts dissected his blinking, his posture, his phrasing, but one line echoed louder than anything else. This is politics. Not quite a denial, not quite a defense, just desperation. And this time, it wasn't enough. But this time, the old playbook didn't land. This is politics had always worked, to deflect, divide, delay. But now it sounded tired. The country wasn't tuning in to hear excuses. It was watching to see if a man built on fear could survive when the fear turned back on him. And when the hearing room doors opened the next morning, 2 very different histories walked into the light. O'Reilly entered first. Cameras fired in bursts as he walked slowly, stiffly, eyes straight ahead. He wore a pale blue tie and a suit that looked too carefully chosen. His jaw clenched. His hands stayed at his sides. No nods, no smiles. Just a man trying to look taller than the weight on his back. He paused at the witness table long enough for one last photo. The fallen giant still pretending he wasn't. Then Jasmine Crockett appeared. No spotlight, no flash. Just presence. A navy blue suit, white blouse, folder in hand. She didn't look around, didn't wave. She moved like someone who didn't come to perform, but to finish what others were too afraid to start. She didn't look at O'Reilly. She didn't need to. Her pace said enough. Steady, precise, surgical. When the gavel struck, O'Reilly leaned into the mic. I'm a victim of cancel culture, he said, voice low, rehearsed. Crockett looked up, expression unreadable. Then came her answer. Calm, cutting. You're not a victim of cancel culture. You're a product of silence culture. His lips curled into a faint smirk, but his eyes faltered. And in that moment, the room felt it. He was smiling not out of confidence, but out of fear. The room was silent, not the kind of silence that waits, but the kind that knows something irreversible is coming. Jasmine Crockett didn't raise her voice. She didn't even raise her hand. She simply reached into the manila folder she had kept closed for the last 20 minutes and pulled out one document. She placed it flat on the table in front of her, smoothed its corners with a single motion, and then slid it across to the clerk without a word. Within seconds, it appeared on the monitors above. The title was plain, clinical, Settlement Agreement between Liz Wheel and Bill O'Reilly. But the text below it was anything but routine. There it was in black and white, line after line of tightly written clauses, each one designed not to protect truth, but to bury it. The amount, $32 million. The terms, absolute silence. Liz Wheel, a former Fox News analyst and legal contributor, had agreed never to speak publicly about what happened. Never to speak to the press, never to file further legal action, never to even admit that this agreement existed. In exchange, she was paid more money than most Americans would see in 5 lifetimes. And at the bottom, beneath the block paragraphs of legal insulation, sat Bill O'Reilly's signature, bold, unmistakable, and final. Jasmine let the room sit in that reality. She didn't speak right away. She let everyone read it for themselves. Let them see how much silence costs when the one buying it has a national platform and the one selling it has no choice. Then calmly and clearly, she broke the silence. $32 million, she said. Not for a trial, not after a conviction, just to ensure one woman would never speak again. Her eyes scanned the committee, then landed squarely on O'Reilly. This isn't a settlement, it's a muzzle. She leaned slightly forward, the tone in her voice sharpening. Not louder, just more precise. No one pays $32 million if they're innocent. They pay to disappear the truth. The silence that followed wasn't still, it was boiling. The weight of Crockett's words hovered in the air like smoke after a detonation, and for the first time, the cameras didn't look at her. They turned to him. O'Reilly shifted in his chair, stiff at first, then sharper, like a man fighting his own spine. He cleared his throat once, then leaned in toward the microphone. His voice came out low, slower than usual, each word pushed through clenched teeth. I don't admit wrongdoing, he said. This was a legal solution, a decision made to protect my family, from headlines, from false claims, from damage that can't be undone. His jaw tightened. People think money equals guilt. It doesn't. It equals survival. He paused, blinking rapidly, just once. I've been in this business long enough to know what happens when a lie spreads. You either bury it or it buries you. His tone was meant to sound resolute, but something frayed around the edges, something unspoken that cracked beneath the final word. Across the room, Crockett didn't move. She didn't blink. But the moment was shifting. O'Reilly wasn't just defending himself. He was unraveling in real time, arguing not with the room, but with a truth that had already outrun him. But survival, as the next moment made clear, wasn't something O'Reilly could script anymore. Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett didn't say a word. She didn't shift in her seat or give any dramatic prelude. She simply tapped a key on the touch panel in front of her, and the room dimmed as the screen behind her lit up. A timestamp flashed. June 14th, 2013. Studio B, Fox News HQ. The footage was raw and unpolished, clearly taken from a behind-the-scenes surveillance feed. No music, no angles, just a fixed frame and a truth no one had meant for the public to see. O'Reilly stood off-center in the shot, adjusting his tie between takes. A young female technician entered from the right, quietly approaching the camera rig. What followed wasn't a burst of rage. It was something colder, more calculated. His voice cut through the silence, sharp and entitled. If you're going to walk into my line of sight, at least pretend you belong here, he said, not looking at her. The woman froze mid-step. He turned slightly, sneering. Do you want to be on camera, sweetheart? Or do you want to keep your job? She gave a short nod, barely audible, then turned and walked out of frame. There was no shouting, no physical contact, but every syllable was loaded with dominance. The tape ended. The lights returned, and so did the silence. It wasn't a smoking gun in a courtroom sense, but it was devastating in the one place O'Reilly had once controlled absolutely: optics. He had made a career out of polished delivery, controlled narrative, and absolute authority in front of a camera. But this wasn't his camera. This was the version of him that didn't know he was being watched. And that, Jasmine knew, was the only version that mattered now. She didn't raise her voice. Her tone didn't change. But the quiet command in her voice pulled everyone forward in their seats. "You used to host a segment called the No Spin Zone," she said evenly, "where facts mattered, where posturing had no place." She paused just long enough to let the memory settle over the room like dust on a forgotten name. "But today, Mr. O'Reilly," she continued, her eyes locked onto his, "there is nowhere left to spin." Across the table, he said nothing. He didn't even look at her. His jaw flexed once, then again. A man once known for owning the room now couldn't meet the eyes of the woman dismantling him piece by piece. The audience didn't applaud. This wasn't that kind of theater. But even in silence, something had shifted. What they had just seen wasn't about politics. It wasn't about left or right. It was about the tone a powerful man used when no one he respected was listening. And in that moment, the nation saw it for what it was. Not just arrogance, but expectation. An expectation of obedience, invisibility, and consequence-free cruelty. Jasmine didn't celebrate. She didn't even blink, because she knew this was only the beginning. The silence that followed wasn't just heavy, it was personal. Not the kind that waits for someone to speak, but the kind that forces them to. Everyone in the room had just watched the same footage. Everyone had heard the words. They were not shouted. They were not disguised. They were quiet, cutting, calculated. The kind of words that don't leave bruises but leave damage. O'Reilly, once the man who spoke over guests, over critics, over entire segments, was now sitting in a room where no one was interrupting him. And the weight of that was visible on his face. He cleared his throat, the sound rough and too loud against the stillness. His fingers tightened around the microphone, knuckles pale. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and tight, like he was forcing it past something lodged deep in his chest. "It was a joke," he said. "We joked around. That was the nature of the studio." He paused, then added, almost mechanically, "There was no complaint." None filed. But he didn't look at Jasmine. He didn't look at the committee. He didn't look at the monitors still frozen on the technician's face. Instead, he stared down at the desk in front of him, as if the truth might disappear if he avoided its reflection. His words were carefully chosen, legally safe, emotionally hollow. He tried to make them sound normal, like a rational explanation in a world that had gone irrational. But they didn't sound like truth. They sounded like damage control, like something rehearsed. And maybe once that might have worked. Maybe 5 years ago, or even 5 days ago, the benefit of the doubt would have been enough. But not here, not today, not after the silence of the woman on the screen said more than any lawsuit ever could. Jasmine didn't move. She didn't respond. She didn't need to. The room had already done it for her. The shift wasn't loud. It was slow, quiet, and devastating. It was in the way staffers stopped taking notes, in how some of the committee members lowered their eyes, in how even the court reporters paused for a breath they didn't realize they were holding. What had just been heard was not a defense. It was the sound of a man grasping for a world that no longer existed, and watching, in real time, as it slipped away. And just when it seemed the room might breathe again, Jasmine Crockett took it to the one place O'Reilly could no longer reach. Someone else's voice. She tapped her microphone once, calmly, then said, "The committee will now hear sworn testimony from Witness 7. The monitors shifted. A new feed appeared, dimly lit, featureless. The figure on screen was blurred entirely. Voice modulation gave her a mechanical tone, but nothing could disguise the quiet control behind each word. "I was 26, the witness began. I had just been promoted to junior producer on a segment Mr. O'Reilly hosted. It was supposed to be a step forward in my career." Her voice never cracked. It didn't need to. The story did that on its own. "One afternoon, I was reviewing notes outside the green room. He called me in. The door closed behind me. There was a pause, not for effect, but because some memories still asked for permission. He asked if I wanted to keep moving up, told me I was smart for someone who didn't come from money. Then he stepped between me and the door and smiled. The room was completely still. Even the court reporters had stopped typing. The voice continued. I got out. I told my supervisor, and 4 days later, I was called into legal. Her tone flattened. They told me Fox had a process for situations like mine, that I would be compensated for the confusion. I was handed a document, already printed, $5 million, a non-disclosure agreement. If I signed, I kept my reputation. If I didn't, they couldn't guarantee anything. Another beat of silence. I signed because I was scared, because I thought survival meant silence. The screen faded to black. Crockett didn't move for a moment. She let the silence breathe. She looked across the room, not at O'Reilly, but at the committee, at the press, at the public watching from living rooms and phones and courtrooms across the country. Then she leaned slightly toward her microphone and said, they didn't just pay for silence. They built a system to enforce it. But today, that system is breaking. Today, I bought time. Not to speak over her, but to let her finally be heard. There was no reaction from O'Reilly. None. He didn't reach for the mic. He didn't shift in his chair. He just stared, unmoving, unblinking, at the half-empty water glass in front of him. The condensation had formed a slow, trembling ring on the wood. His eyes never left it, as if looking up would mean accepting that the world he had once ruled no longer recognized him as its voice. No rebuttal, no anger, just stillness. The kind of stillness that doesn't come from discipline, but from knowing there's nothing left to say. Because what had just happened wasn't theater. It was exposure. And this time, he wasn't the one holding the camera. The room hadn't moved since the last witness disappeared from the screen. But Jasmine Crockett was already preparing her next incision. She didn't need to explain that silence had been bought. Now she was going to prove how many times it had been, down to the cent. She retrieved the final document from her folder and handed it to the clerk. This one wasn't dramatic in appearance, just a spreadsheet, no logos, no cover page. But as it flashed onto the monitors, the shift in the room was immediate. It wasn't the format that stunned them. It was the content. Across the screen, a long list of internal financial transactions originating from a legal account marked Holden and Bright L, LP, Reserve Trust C. Line after line, each entry a quiet confession. Payments of $750,000, $1.25 million, $400,000. Each one labeled with clinical precision. Intern locker room, post-incident agreement. Production coordinator, Studio B complaint, NDA extension, subject, on-air comment. There were no names, just roles, titles, and timestamps, all carefully recorded, all matched to allegations that, until now, had never seen daylight. Crockett stood silent for a few seconds, letting the screen speak for itself. She didn't raise her voice or drive the point with a lecture. She just let the numbers breathe. Let them show what the polished PR statements never had. This wasn't damage control. It was a system, a mechanism designed to absorb scandal, neutralize victims, and preserve reputations, quietly, efficiently, and with precision. The kind of system that doesn't exist by accident. The kind that requires approval, sign-off, and someone with enough power to authorize payout after payout without question. She didn't name O'Reilly in that moment. She didn't have to. His role in the architecture was already written between every line of every transaction. The silence that followed was different than before. This wasn't stunned disbelief. It was cold understanding. No one coughed. No one looked down to take notes. They didn't need to. The truth wasn't speculative anymore. It was procedural, boring even in how routine it had become. And that, in many ways, was the most horrifying part. Jasmine's voice finally returned, calm but resolute. This isn't just a pattern, she said. It's a ledger of silence. Every dollar a warning, every line a threat. Not because they were afraid of lies, but because they were terrified of the truth. The numbers had done what no accusation could. They collapsed the illusion. For several long seconds, the room remained frozen in that reality. Then, without warning, Bill O'Reilly broke the stillness. He leaned forward with a sudden, sharp movement, his voice louder now, sharper, more brittle. "This isn't justice," he snapped. "This is theater." His fingers gripped the edge of the table, and for the first time in the hearing, the practiced restraint cracked. "You don't care about the truth, Congresswoman. You care about the optics. You care about headlines. You want your viral moment, and you're using me to get it." His voice didn't shake, but his eyes did. It wasn't the fury of a man who knew he was innocent. It was the rage of someone who'd lost control of the narrative. "You think you're some kind of savior?" he continued. "I built careers. I gave people platforms, including Lee Stott." He let the name hang in the air like it was his final card. "And now she sends a letter? Hiding behind paper and lawyers? I don't get to defend myself against that, do I?" But Jasmine Crockett didn't respond. She didn't meet the volume with volume. She simply opened a single envelope that had been resting untouched beside her notes. The paper inside was soft, folded once down the middle. No legal header, no formal statement, just handwriting, elegant, deliberate, and unforgiving. She unfolded the page with the care of someone holding something sacred. Then she read aloud. "I don't need an apology," the letter said. Crockett's voice didn't rise, but it rang clear in every corner of the chamber. "I need someone who will make sure this never happens to another woman again. No anger, no accusation, just the kind of truth that leaves no room to run." She folded the letter in silence and placed it gently back on the table, next to the documents that had torn through layers of denial. And still, she didn't look at O'Reilly, because she wasn't speaking to him anymore. She was speaking to the space he once occupied, the one he used to control. The room had changed. Everyone could feel it. This wasn't about ideology now. It wasn't about parties or press cycles or even scandal. It was about reckoning. And in that silence, deep, cold, final, O'Reilly muttered something under his breath, barely audible to the microphones, but it was enough. "I helped her," he said, not to anyone in particular. His voice was hoarse now, eyes glassy. "I helped her, and now she's using me to build her career?" He wasn't asking. He was unraveling. The bravado was gone. What was left wasn't anger. It was disbelief. The quiet kind that sets in when a man who built his empire on control finally realizes it's gone. That no clip, no contract, no audience could shield him from what had already landed. The cameras didn't zoom in. They didn't have to. The image of him sitting there, small, hunched, fingers curled around a half-empty glass of water, was already burned into the moment. There was no standing ovation, no dramatic gavel, just the steady breath of history being made without permission. And Crockett? She didn't nod. She didn't speak. She just watched. Not as a woman seeking victory, but as someone who had been on the other side of silence and chose today to be the one who broke it. The air in the room had grown heavy, not from noise, but from the weight of what had already been said, already shown, already proven. The pages had spoken. The video had spoken. The voices of the unnamed had filled the chamber with a truth so sharp it cut through years of silence in seconds. But Jasmine Crockett wasn't finished. She had taken this hearing step by step, not for spectacle, not for politics, but to build something that couldn't be ignored, couldn't be spun, and couldn't be forgotten. Now she stood at the edge of the final question, the one no chart or contract could answer. Her hand rested on the table, steady as ever. Her eyes didn't flicker. Her tone didn't rise. And yet, when she spoke, the entire room seemed to stop breathing. "How many women," she asked, each word clear, deliberate, and low, "walked into your office and didn't walk out whole?" The question didn't hang in the air. It landed, full weight, full force, without needing volume or emphasis. No one spoke. No one coughed. Even the click of a camera shutter, constant earlier in the hearing, was suddenly gone. All eyes were on O'Reilly. But it wasn't the attention he had once thrived on. This wasn't admiration. It was expectation. The kind that doesn't ask for entertainment. It demands truth. O'Reilly didn't respond at first. His hands remained folded on the table, but the grip had tightened. His knuckles were pale, almost trembling, though he tried to keep them still. His chest rose with a slow breath, calculated, practiced, but the mask was slipping. He looked up, but not at Crockett, not at anyone. His eyes found the space between the nameplate and the microphone, and stayed there, fixed, distant, trapped. His mouth opened slightly as if to speak, but then closed again. The seconds passed, and with each one, the silence deepened. Not empty, but thick with everything he chose not to say. It wasn't just that he didn't answer the question, it was that he couldn't. Not without pulling loose every brick in the wall he'd built around himself for decades. When he finally spoke, it was a whisper, not to the committee, not to Jasmine, but almost to himself. "They want my career dead," he said, and the words came out cracked, uneven. His voice, once powerful enough to command prime time, now barely reached the microphone. "They want everything I built to collapse." He didn't look angry, not anymore. He looked displaced, like a man standing in the ashes of something he had never imagined would burn. Across from him, Crockett remained still. She didn't blink. She didn't reach for notes or the mic. Her silence didn't feel passive. It felt earned. It felt like control reclaimed. She let his words sit in the space for a moment, let them echo in a room that had already heard too many excuses. Then she leaned forward just slightly, not aggressive, not performative, just enough to make sure every syllable that followed would land. "No," she said, her voice calm, but unshakably firm. "They don't want your career to die, Mr. O'Reilly. They want something far more human. They want you to remember." He didn't look up. His jaw flexed, but his body remained still. "They want you to remember what it felt like to be alone in a room with someone who had power over them. To remember the words that weren't jokes, the doors that didn't stay open, the choices they were forced to make just to get out, and the silence they were forced to live with after." Her voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. It carried the weight of testimony that had never made it into court. It carried the names of women who weren't on the screen, weren't in the news, but whose fingerprints were on every document, every line of that spreadsheet, every footstep that brought this hearing into existence. "They want you to remember," she continued, "because the world didn't, because the system didn't, and because for years, decades, you were allowed to forget." The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was full, full of memory, of grief, of all the things that had been too expensive to say until now. No one moved, no one dared, because they weren't just witnessing the unraveling of a man. They were witnessing the confrontation of an entire era, the era of immunity, of unchecked power wrapped in charm and contracts and airtime. And in this moment, it had finally met the one thing it had never prepared for: accountability with a name and a voice. O'Reilly's eyes were red now, not from tears exactly, but from the effort it took to hold them back. His face was pale, his shoulders hunched slightly forward, like the weight of the question was pressing down on his spine. Still, he didn't reply. He didn't argue. He didn't reach for a lawyer's note or a planned rebuttal, because no script in the world had ever prepared him for this part. The part where the women who had once been edited out of the frame were now writing the final lines. Jasmine sat back slightly, hands folded again in front of her. She didn't gloat. She didn't smile. She didn't need to. Her strength wasn't in winning, it was in witnessing, in standing firm, in refusing to let this man, or any man like him, walk away without being made to see what he had left behind. And the room, though filled with people, felt completely still, as if time itself had paused to absorb what had just passed between them. Not just a question, not just an answer, but the echo of every moment someone chose silence over truth, and someone else profited from it. And now, for the first time, it was O'Reilly who had nothing left to say. The silence O'Reilly left behind didn't last. It didn't fade quietly into the next headline or die in the bottom scroll of cable news. It ignited. Within hours, the footage from the hearing had been clipped, captioned, and uploaded to every major platform. But it wasn't just the speech or the evidence that spread. It was the still frame. Jasmine Crockett seated calmly, staring across the table, and O'Reilly slumped forward, his eyes dark, mouth parted but silent. That single image rocketed across social media like a final verdict. Cold, unarguable, and viral. Hashtags exploded. No more silence. Crockett, hear me? No spin left. Within 24 hours, the hearing video had amassed over 87 million views across YouTube, TikTok, and Instagram. Influencers posted breakdowns, attorneys live-streamed analysis, celebrities tweeted quotes from Jasmine as if they were scripture, and survivors, thousands of them, began speaking. Some anonymously, some directly, some for the first time in years. But this time, something was different. The world didn't look away. By the second day, the story had evolved beyond a public reckoning. It was becoming a legal one. Late that evening, the Office of the New York State Attorney General released a brief but seismic statement. In light of new evidence presented during the Oversight Committee hearing, it read, "We are opening a formal criminal investigation into potential violations of state labor, harassment, and obstruction laws involving multiple former executives and associates of Fox News." The language was careful, but it didn't need to be dramatic. The meaning was clear. The state of New York was no longer waiting for Washington. It was moving. At the same time, a less visible but equally important legal battle began to erupt. Lawyers representing several of the women previously silenced by non-disclosure agreements filed emergency motions in civil court to unseal those contracts. In the filings, they cited public interest, precedent, and a credible pattern of coercion and abuse protected by confidential settlements. And one after another, judges started to listen. By day 5, 3 NDAs had been suspended pending judicial review. By day 10, 2 women had been granted temporary clearance to speak publicly without penalty. And then came the headline no one had expected. A sitting federal judge in the Southern District of New York ruled that, in cases where contracts serve to conceal systemic abuse rather than resolve it, the First Amendment cannot be held hostage by corporate silence. The ruling was immediate, binding, and irreversible. Suddenly, the system O'Reilly and others had relied on for years, the paper fortress of hush money and legal clauses, was cracking. And behind it, voices were pouring out. In Brooklyn, a former segment coordinator held a press conference with her attorney. "I signed that NDA when I was 23, she said, voice shaking but firm. "I thought it was the only way to make it stop. Now I know silence was never my protection. It was his." In Chicago, a former makeup artist wrote an op-ed in the Washington Post, detailing the quiet humiliation she'd endured in studio dressing rooms and the 2-sentence agreement she was once pressured to sign. In Dallas, a former assistant producer went viral reading her NDA on TikTok, then tearing it in half on camera. Each story carried the same weight. Each story turned the spotlight back on the same figure. And still, Jasmine Crockett didn't gloat. She didn't chase interviews. She didn't tweet victory laps. Instead, she released a single statement from her office. Justice should never depend on volume, wealth, or spotlight. It should depend on truth. We were never here to destroy a man. We were here to stop a machine. That machine, once powered by denial, backed by dollars and guarded by contracts, was now under federal scrutiny. Investigators began issuing subpoenas. Journalists began naming not just O'Reilly, but the legal teams, the corporate liaisons, the executives who had signed off on every payout without ever questioning why they were needed. Pressure mounted on the Department of Justice to step in. Advocacy groups launched national campaigns demanding reform of how NDAs could be used in harassment cases. Editorial boards across the country called for broader inquiries, not just into Fox News, but into media networks, publishing houses, political institutions. The question had shifted from what did he do to how many others got away with it. And still, O'Reilly said nothing. He hadn't been seen publicly since the hearing. His podcast, once aired weekly without fail, went dark. Scheduled speaking engagements were quietly canceled. His last book deal was suspended by the publisher, pending further developments. In a rare and brief statement, his legal team said he was reviewing his options. But there were fewer options now, because this time, the damage wasn't reputation, it was legal. And the walls that once protected him weren't just cracking, they were collapsing. For Jasmine Crockett, the spotlight never seemed to change her posture. She continued her work in Congress, attending committee meetings, introducing bills aimed at transparency in corporate settlements and granting precisely one interview to a local public radio station in her district. When asked what moment from the hearing stayed with her the most, she didn't mention the letter. She didn't mention the spreadsheet. She didn't even mention the final exchange. Instead, she said calmly, "It was the silence in the room, when the truth no longer needed to be shouted. It just stood there, and no one could move past it." And across America, that silence was still rippling. In boardrooms, in newsrooms, in courtrooms where judges were now rereading contracts they had once rubber-stamped without pause. It wasn't just that people were listening. It was that, for the first time, those in power were being forced to. Because when a system is built to bury voices, the real revolution isn't in how loud you shout. It's in what happens when the silence finally breaks and the truth refuses to go back underground. And when the system finally cracked open, the voices that had been buried the longest rose first. It began quietly, just a single name. A former production assistant who, days after the NDA ruling was overturned, posted a photo of herself on social media. No words, just her name, the date she signed the agreement, and the caption, "I am no longer afraid." Within an hour, it was shared 40,000 times. Within a day, 4 more women followed. They came from different departments, different cities, even different decades, but their stories formed the same arc. Isolation, power imbalance, forced silence. Each post peeled back a layer of the facade, showing the personal cost behind every corporate denial. They didn't speak like victims. They spoke like people reclaiming ownership of what had been taken from them. Dignity, memory, voice. By the end of the week, more than 30 women had come forward, and they weren't just telling their stories to reporters. They were testifying, writing, organizing. One launched a nonprofit dedicated to helping others escape NDA entrapment. Another appeared on national television, reading excerpts from the original contract she had once been told to burn. A third, a former intern, stood outside the very Fox News building where she once ran scripts across floors, holding a sign that read, "He remembered none of us. We never forgot him." The stories weren't all dramatic. Many were subtle, moments that hadn't seemed worth reporting at the time. A hand on the lower back that lingered too long, a comment whispered behind a teleprompter, a threat made in the pause between meetings. But taken together, they revealed something undeniable. This wasn't a scandal. It was a system. And now, for the first time, that system was being named by the women it once buried. And at the center of this rising wave was Jasmine Crockett. She never called herself the center. In every interview she gave, she redirected credit to the survivors. In every headline, she insisted the moment wasn't hers, but the country's. And yet, the world saw her differently. She had not just asked the hard questions. She had held the silence. She had looked power in the eye and refused to blink. She had taken what was meant to be a performance and turned it into a reckoning. And the world noticed. 2 weeks after the hearing, Crockett was invited to speak before the United Nations in Geneva at a special session on freedom from institutional silence. She didn't accept immediately. Her office reportedly requested the focus remain on survivors, not her. But the UN made its position clear. In a global landscape where silence is often written into law, her ability to unearth truth without spectacle, without cruelty, without retreat, was precisely what the world needed to see. When she arrived at the UN headquarters, the air was crisp, the sky gray over the glass-paneled Palais des Nations. Delegates from over 70 countries were in attendance. Survivors from multiple nations sat in the gallery. Journalists from Uganda, activists from India, union leaders from Brazil. When she walked to the podium, she didn't wear designer. She didn't carry a prepared speech with sweeping rhetoric. She brought one page, typed in 14-point font, no seal, no logo, just her voice. "I did not come to silence a man," she said. "I came to end the silence that let him exist unchecked." She spoke for only 9 minutes. She quoted no political figures. She cited no polling. She spoke instead of the intern who never reported what happened in a hallway, the producer who didn't sign the NDA but still carried the shame, the women who still hadn't spoken and maybe never would, but who, for the first time, had seen their pain mirrored back without being mocked, dismissed, or forgotten. She closed with a sentence that would be translated into 36 languages by the end of the week. Silence was never a symptom. It was the strategy, and truth is the only cure brave enough to break it. When she stepped down from the podium, the room did not erupt in applause. It stood, slowly, quietly, one by one, not for spectacle, but for recognition. Later that evening, under quiet candlelight during a private ceremony attended by international human rights leaders, Jasmine Crockett was presented with the UN Human Dignity Award for the protection of voice and silence, a title that hadn't existed until that moment. The citation read simply, "For holding space when the world had forgotten how to listen." But Crockett, when she stepped up to accept, did not take credit. "This belongs to the women who spoke," she said, looking across the sea of faces, some tearful, some defiant, all changed. "And to those who still cannot. My name was not the first one erased. It will not be the last. But while I have breath, I will never let silence be mistaken for peace again." The next morning, the front pages of papers across the world carried variations of the same image. Jasmine Crockett, standing with her head bowed slightly, not triumphant, but grounded. She wasn't there to claim victory. She was there to hold the line. Back in the US, her office was flooded with letters. Not all of them supportive. Some were vicious, others were heartbroken. But the most powerful came from a woman in rural Kansas. Handwritten, no return address. It read, "I watched you stand without raising your voice. I watched him shrink without you needing to shout. I watched the world finally listen. I'm not ready to tell my story yet, but I wanted you to know I'm still here, and now I believe I matter." Thank you. Crockett never shared the letter publicly. She didn't post it, didn't quote it in any future speech, but she framed it quietly and placed it on the shelf behind her desk, next to the Constitution, next to a framed photo of her first legal mentor, next to the folded UN program from Geneva. Because this fight had never been about fame. It had never been about destroying one man's career or elevating her own. It had always been about a single radical idea, that those who have been silenced the longest are the ones the world must finally be brave enough to hear. And now, thanks to her, they were. But Crockett knew that standing on the world stage meant nothing if the laws back home still protected silence more than people. The applause in Geneva had faded. The headlines had cycled. The hearing room had emptied. But injustice, real, systemic injustice, wasn't undone by truth alone. It needed structure. It needed laws. It needed mechanisms that couldn't be ignored or rewritten in closed-door settlements. Because as long as legal agreements could be weaponized to erase pain, the architecture of abuse would remain intact, no matter how many hearings were held. Jasmine knew it, and she wasn't going to let this be just a moment. It had to be a turning point. So she went back to Washington and did what few expected her to do. She opened a new front, not on the airwaves, not on the Senate floor, but in the ink of legislative texts. A new bill, aggressive, unapologetic, written not to calm the system, but to challenge it. It was called the Federal Media Accountability and Victim Protection Act, and it was unlike anything that had ever reached committee in modern congressional history. The language was surgical, no legal vagueness, no corporate loopholes. It required full transparency for any monetary settlement involving sexual harassment, discrimination, or abuse inside publicly licensed media institutions. It banned NDAs from being used to suppress claims of sexual misconduct or retaliation. And most controversially, it made retroactive disclosure possible if a judge determined a prior agreement was used to conceal systemic harm. Survivors could come forward. Corporations would be exposed. Truth would be disentangled from the contracts that once strangled it. Crockett introduced it with no fanfare, no press conference, no campaign video. Just a packet, 84 pages, delivered directly to the speaker's desk, with her name etched quietly on the final page. But the reaction was immediate. Within hours, the media exploded. Not just the progressive outlets, but even the ones who had once protected the very mechanisms the bill sought to dismantle. Editorial boards called it a tectonic shift in media ethics. Conservative pundits called it a direct assault on corporate confidentiality. Survivors called it something else entirely. Hope. Still, the resistance was fierce. Within days, major networks and syndicates began lobbying hard behind the scenes. Executives called committee chairs. Legal counsels drafted opposition memos. Trade organizations warned of a chilling effect on internal investigations. Crockett received letters from newsroom lawyers, from retired anchors, from board members. Some urged her to narrow the scope. Others accused her of betrayal. But the sharpest letter came unsigned, delivered in an unmarked envelope, typed in all caps. "You don't get to destroy us and walk away clean." She didn't flinch. She'd seen worse. At the first reading of the bill before the House Subcommittee on Legal Reform, the room was standing room only, not because of who was present, but because of who wasn't silenced anymore. Behind the press rows, survivors sat shoulder to shoulder, former assistants, editors, junior producers. One woman sat alone in the back, holding her original NDA in a clear plastic binder, highlighted in yellow and annotated in red. "This is what my silence cost." Crockett stood and began, not with legalese, but with memory. "I have seen what silence does when it's purchased. I have seen what it means when institutions value image over humanity. I am tired of systems that call victims liabilities and predators assets. This bill does not punish truth, it protects it. And if that makes the powerful uncomfortable, then we are finally doing something right." Her words were clipped, precise, not emotional in tone, but devastating in clarity. When she cited the spreadsheet from the hearing, the one filled with seven-figure payouts and chilling labels like Stage 3 NDAs, do not review, the chamber fell into a stunned, breathless stillness. The next speaker, a former network compliance attorney, tried to downplay the bill as overbroad and emotionally driven. He called it a legislative overcorrection. Jasmine said nothing as he spoke. But when he finished, she asked one question: "How many settlements did you personally approve without asking what actually happened?" He couldn't answer. The subcommittee vote was narrow, 10-8, but the bill advanced. It was sent to full judiciary review, where the real battle began. The days that followed were ruthless. Lobbyists launched full-scale campaigns. Ads ran on primetime TV accusing the bill of weaponizing trauma. One cable host called it Crockett's Cancel Culture Manifesto. But Jasmine didn't take the bait. She kept working. Quietly, relentlessly. She met with survivor advocates. She spoke to attorneys who had once enforced the very NDAs she now sought to dismantle. She listened, not just to outrage, but to fear. Fear from staffers who worried they'd never be hired again if their names became public. Fear from men who had once enabled abuse and now wondered if their silence would be enough to convict them in the court of history. And slowly, momentum shifted. Law professors endorsed the bill. Former DOJ officials offered pro bono counsel. Civil rights groups marched outside the Capitol, holding signs that read, "The truth isn't confidential." Even a few anchors, well-known, respected, and quietly sidelined for years, spoke out on late-night interviews. "If this law had existed when I came forward," one said, "I might still have a career. But more importantly, I might have kept my name." By the time the bill reached the House floor, it had gained co-sponsors from both sides of the aisle. Some backed it out of conviction, others out of public pressure. But it didn't matter. The tide had turned. And when the vote came, the chamber held its breath. The final count, 228 to 202. It passed. There was no applause. Not right away. The moment was too dense, too earned. Jasmine sat at her desk in the chamber, fingers interlaced, eyes closed. She didn't smile. She didn't cry. She just exhaled. Outside, reporters shouted questions. Microphones waited. But Crockett said only this: "Power wrote the rules. We just rewrote the consequences." And that night, when the bill's passage hit the news cycle, something extraordinary happened. The silence didn't return. It stayed broken. And now, for the first time in American media history, silence no longer belonged to the highest bidder. It belonged to the people who survived it, and to the woman who refused to let the system forget them again. But when power is finally made accountable, it doesn't fall in a single moment. It unravels, contract by contract, deal by deal, name by name. The ink on the Federal Media Accountability and Victim Protection Act was still drying when the ripple began. Quiet at first, subtle, a phone call canceled, a segment cut, a PR statement delayed, but it moved quickly, like smoke finding every open hallway in a sealed building. And at the center of it all sat Bill O'Reilly, no longer a titan, no longer a brand, no longer the man who once commanded millions of viewers nightly with a raised brow and a sharpened pause. Now he was a liability, a weight, a name executives didn't want to explain at press junkets or investment meetings. One by one, the scaffolding he'd built around himself began to collapse. The first to go was his podcast syndication deal. It had been one of the last holdouts, an audio platform with a broad conservative base that had hosted his weekly show for years, standing by him through controversy after controversy. But not this time. 3 days after the bill passed, the company quietly removed all archived episodes from their homepage. No statement, no apology, just a blank space where his name used to be. Listeners searching for the O'Reilly update were met with a 404 error and a single-line redirect. This content is no longer available. The silence wasn't just technological, it was cultural. O'Reilly had once defined what it meant to dominate a media cycle. Now he couldn't even find a host. By the end of the week, the publishing industry followed suit. His most recent book, a political memoir slated for fall release, was canceled by his longtime publisher. The contract was terminated under a previously dormant clause citing reputational harm exceeding public tolerance thresholds. It wasn't just the new book. It was all of them. Every title in print, every digital edition. Within 72 hours, Amazon delisted his author profile. Major retailers pulled his books from online shelves. Physical copies disappeared from bestseller displays. Libraries and schools received quiet instructions to reevaluate holdings. He wasn't banned. He was erased, systematically, efficiently, as if his words had never filled shelves, topped charts, or shaped minds. And still, it didn't stop. Sponsors began backing away from his name like it was radioactive. Insurance firms, political forums, college speaking circuits, each had once used his image to draw in donors, crowds, viewers. Now contracts were nullified overnight. His legal team sent cease and desist threats. Some platforms responded. Most didn't, because the real message had already been delivered, not through lawsuits or interviews, but through the cultural algorithm itself. He was no longer safe to sell. Inside his private office, the calls slowed, then stopped. The assistants left. The inbox went quiet. The hallway that once buzzed with producers, interns, publicists, it stood empty. The blinds were closed now, not for privacy, for shame. He was still free, legally. No one had dragged him from his home. No one had frozen his accounts. But he was no longer welcome. Not in the industry he built. Not in the ecosystem he had once fed. And what made it worse, what made it unbearable, wasn't the backlash. It was the silence. The same kind of silence he had once used against others. The kind that doesn't argue, doesn't shout, doesn't defend. It just removes you, leaves you staring at the door you once slammed on someone else. The final blow came not from a headline, but from a software update. One morning, he opened the podcast app on his phone, the same one he used to check his ratings, track his growth, feel connected. It updated automatically. When it reopened, his show tile was gone. Not grayed out, not locked. Gone. Replaced by a new feature box titled, Voices Worth Hearing. Front and center was a familiar face, Jasmine Crockett. It wasn't a personal attack. It was an algorithmic verdict. And that's when it hit him. Not as a scandal, not as a lawsuit, but as a fact. He had become irrelevant. This wasn't cancellation, it was exodus. The world wasn't throwing stones, it was moving on. Across the country, in homes and schools and offices, people spoke his name with past tense verbs. He once had a show. Didn't he get taken down by? There was no more fear, no more weight, just fading memory. A figure being dissolved in public consciousness, not by rage, but by irrelevance. And still, Jasmine Crockett said nothing about him directly. She was working, drafting companion legislation, meeting with international human rights monitors, preparing testimony on corporate ethics. She didn't mention O'Reilly, not once, because for her, this had never been about bringing down a man. It was about breaking the mold that let men like him flourish unchecked. That mold was shattered now, and the industry that had once defended him was busy distancing itself, not out of guilt, but out of self-preservation. In interviews, journalists tried to draw her into the fire. Do you feel vindicated? Was this personal? What would you say to him now? She never gave them what they wanted. What she said instead was this: power doesn't always scream when it's dying. Sometimes it just disappears because the truth finally outlived the lie. And it had. O'Reilly wasn't in hiding. He still lived in his New Jersey estate, still took morning walks alone, still ordered the same takeout from the same restaurant where no one asked for autographs anymore. But the empire was gone. The studios, the publishers, the revenue streams, the invitations, the illusion. One morning he turned on the television. Not cable, just network. And there on a Sunday morning roundtable sat a panel of voices, diverse, articulate, fiery. Women, men, journalists, professors. They were debating media ethics, sharing survivor stories, quoting law. One of them mentioned the Accountability Act and praised the courage it took to pass it. No one said his name, not once. That, he realized, was the true erasure. Not censorship, irrelevance. He turned off the TV, closed the curtains, sat at his desk. The silence, once his greatest weapon, was now his only companion. And for the first time in his career, he finally understood what it felt like to be unheard. But sometimes the most powerful endings don't come with applause. They come with the kind of silence that means the room has changed, and no one dares pretend otherwise. The vote had passed. The hearings were over. The cameras had packed up. The legal memos were already being drafted by a dozen federal offices. The press pool had moved on to its next target, its next flame. But the building itself, the halls of Congress, still echoing with the voices that had once tried to drown her out, remained exactly as she remembered. Polished floors, overhead fluorescents too white, and marble columns that had watched generations of battles before this one. And now Jasmine Crockett was alone. Not alone in fear, alone in purpose. The kind of aloneness that only comes after a war is won not with weapons, but with truth. Her heels struck the floor with soft, even rhythm as she stepped out from the chamber and into the east hallway of the Capitol. The air felt colder out here, not because of temperature, but because the adrenaline had finally left her body. The weight of the testimony, the stories, the stares, everything that had tried to shake her, had finally released its grip. She had spoken calmly. She had held the line. She had watched one of the most powerful voices in media fall silent, not because she shouted, but because she refused to. The lights above buzzed faintly. She walked with no phone in her hand, no aide at her side, just the echo of her own footsteps and the thrum of history still vibrating in her chest. And then she heard a voice, small, not afraid, but tentative, like someone testing whether they were allowed to ask what had been sitting in their chest for hours. Congresswoman Crockett? Jasmine turned. A young woman, barely 20 maybe, stood against the far wall. A Hill intern. Hair pulled back, notepad clutched to her chest like a shield. Her ID badge twisted on its lanyard. She wasn't supposed to be here. Not in this hallway, not without clearance. But she was here anyway, because something had compelled her to follow. Because something she had just witnessed had changed her understanding of what power looked like and who could wield it. She took one careful step forward and asked, almost in a whisper, "How do you stay calm in front of men like that?" The question didn't come from awe. It came from necessity. It came from someone who knew what it was to swallow anger, to force a smile, to pretend smaller so others didn't feel threatened. It came from someone who saw herself not in Crockett's title, but in her silence, controlled, deliberate, and unbreakable. Jasmine didn't answer right away. She looked at the girl, really looked. She saw the tension in her jaw, the way her shoes didn't quite fit, the way her breath caught halfway between hope and fear. It wasn't just a question, it was a lifeline, thrown across a gulf of power and time, and Jasmine knew exactly what it cost to ask it. She took one slow step toward the intern, then another, and finally she stood directly in front of her, not towering, not posturing, just present, grounded. She said gently but clearly, "I don't stay calm." The girl blinked. Jasmine's voice didn't rise, but it carried, steady, unshaken. "I stand still so they can't see the storm. But make no mistake, there's always a storm." She let the words settle. Let them do what no headline or clip could do. Then she added more quietly, "The calm isn't real, the control is. And I don't hold it for them. I hold it for every woman who never got the chance to ask that question." The intern's eyes widened, just slightly. There was no hero worship in her face, just recognition. Jasmine placed a hand gently on the girl's shoulder, not for comfort, but for connection. And in that touch was a lineage, the passing of something stronger than advice, stronger than courage, legacy. Jasmine took one breath, then pulled back. "They want us loud so they can call us angry," she said. "They want us silent so they can say we had nothing to say. So I give them neither. I give them stillness they can't shake. And when they try to push me out, I make them look me in the eye." Behind her, the doors to the chamber creaked shut. The moment was over. The headlines would shift. The country would forget pieces. But this would last. The intern didn't speak. She just nodded. Not in obedience, in understanding. And Jasmine Crockett turned once more, walking toward the end of the hallway, where the afternoon light had begun to cut through the stained glass. It painted the floor in fractured color, red, gold, violet. It didn't feel like an ending. It felt like a beginning no one could now deny. And somewhere behind her, barely loud enough to hear, the young woman whispered, "Not for the record, not for the news, but for herself. Because I didn't come here to argue. I came here to end it." And Jasmine, without turning back, smiled. Not wide, not for show. Just enough to say, "You've understood everything." Thank you for watching until this moment and for standing with us on this journey for justice. Your support means everything. Like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss what's next. And we'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below and let us know what moved you most in this story. Together, our voices make a difference. In a courtroom packed with over 10 million viewers, Jasmine Crockett stands up against the tech mogul, Jeff Bezos, accusing him of using Amazon's power to manipulate elections and control the flow of information. As the pressure mounts, Bezos defends his empire with cold, calculated arrogance. But what happens next will change everything. With explosive evidence and a bombshell revelation, Bezos is forced to confront a truth he cannot escape. What did Jasmine say that left Bezos speechless? And how will he respond to this undeniable truth? Stay with us. This is a story worth every second of your time. The congressional hearing room was suffocatingly packed, with more than 10 million Americans watching live. The tension was so thick you could almost feel it in the air. Jeff Bezos, the formidable founder of Amazon, stepped up to the witness stand, his stride calm yet purposeful, the kind of confidence only a billionaire tech mogul could exude. His gaze swept over the room, unflinching, as if the weight of the nation's scrutiny barely registered. Adjusting his suit with a nonchalant flick, he sat down slowly, his eyes meeting those of the committee members with a subtle, almost imperceptible nod. But across the room, the atmosphere shifted. Jasmine Crockett, the fierce Democratic representative from Texas, stood tall. Her every movement was filled with quiet, unyielding determination. As she took her first step toward the front of the room, all eyes turned to her, sharp, focused, ready for the showdown to come. This wasn't just a hearing. It was a battle that would either reinforce the power of corporate giants or expose their dark manipulation. The stakes had never been higher, and Crockett was prepared to bring it all to the light. The question at hand was explosive. Amazon, the empire Bezos had meticulously built, was now facing accusations of using its sprawling influence to tilt the political landscape in its favor. Allegations had surfaced that Amazon had funneled millions into political campaigns and strategically manipulated its platform to push its own agenda. The implications were staggering. If proven true, it would be nothing less than a betrayal of the very democratic principles this country was built on. Crockett knew this was her moment to tear down the veil of secrecy. As the room simmered with tension, Jasmine Crockett locked eyes with Jeff Bezos. The camera zoomed in on the two figures, the billionaire tech mogul and the fierce congresswoman, each representing polar opposites of power and accountability. The hush in the room grew thick, each moment drawing out the inevitable clash between corporate might and the voice of justice. Crockett's pulse quickened, but her face remained calm, unwavering. This was her moment. She knew that the eyes of the nation were watching, and this question would either expose Bezos for what he truly was, or elevate him further into the untouchable sphere he had worked so hard to create. With a deep breath, Crockett's voice rang out, slicing through the silence. "Mr. Bezos," she began, her words clear and deliberate, "Amazon is facing serious accusations. You stand accused of using your platform not only as a marketplace, but as a weapon, manipulating the flow of information to further your own interests and influence political outcomes. The American people deserve to know, how do you justify using the immense power of Amazon to manipulate public opinion?" There it was, the question that would cut to the heart of the issue. Bezos's eyes flickered for just a fraction of a second. He shifted in his seat, the calmness of his earlier demeanor beginning to crack. The room held its breath, every eye glued to the two adversaries. Crockett leaned in, not missing a beat. "Are you really telling us that Amazon, under your leadership, hasn't played a role in distorting the truth to serve its own agenda?" Her words didn't just echo in the room. They resonated through the corridors of power, challenging the very fabric of the system that Bezos had so carefully constructed. She had always known that this fight would not be easy, that she would be up against one of the wealthiest men in the world. But what infuriated her more than anything was the blatant disregard for the public's right to know, the manipulation of a platform that millions of Americans trusted. Bezos leaned back in his chair, his eyes momentarily drifting across the room as if calculating his next move. The weight of the question still hung heavily in the air, but now it was his turn to reclaim control. He cleared his throat and straightened, gathering his thoughts with practiced precision. "Let me make one thing perfectly clear," he began, his voice steady, smooth, almost too smooth. "Amazon is a platform. We provide services to millions, and we do so by offering a marketplace where people can buy and sell goods, and where ideas and opinions can be shared freely. We do not interfere in political decisions. We simply give people the tools to make their own choices." The words were well rehearsed, a rehearsed defense from a man who had spent years building an empire on the back of global commerce. But as Bezos continued, a cold, calculated edge slipped into his tone, as if daring anyone to challenge him. He glanced across the room, meeting the eyes of the committee members, trying to assert his dominance in the room. The conservative lawmakers, sitting on the far side, nodded approvingly, their unwavering support for Bezos echoing throughout the room. Crockett could feel the weight of their gazes, the unsaid allegiance between the billionaire and his political allies, and the injustice of it all. These were the very people who, with the stroke of a pen, could allow Amazon to keep operating without accountability. These were the people who wanted to protect a system that worked for Bezos, no matter the consequences for the rest of the country. The conservative members, now emboldened by Bezos's defense, leaned forward in their seats, eager to jump into the fray. Some raised their hands, others shook their heads in agreement. The tide was shifting, and the room was quickly becoming a battleground, divided between those who stood for corporate freedom and those who called for transparency and truth. Jasmine Crockett, undeterred, tightened her jaw. This was no longer just about a hearing. It was a fight for fairness, for accountability. The defense of Bezos felt like a slap in the face, a reminder of the immense power corporations like Amazon held. The tension between the two sides escalated, each word from the conservatives an attempt to drown out the truth. But Crockett wasn't backing down. Not now, not when the stakes were this high. With a sharp motion, Crockett slid a thick stack of documents across the table, her gaze steady as she watched Bezos. The room went silent, every person leaning in to catch her next words. As the papers came to rest before the committee, Crockett spoke, her voice cutting through the tension like a blade. These documents, she began, are internal Amazon records that have recently come to light, and they reveal something disturbing, something that goes far beyond corporate negligence. They show in black and white how Amazon has used its access to customer data to fund political campaigns, campaigns that Amazon has directly influenced. This data, information that millions of Americans have entrusted to you in good faith, has been sold to the highest bidder, and it's been used not just for marketing, but to manipulate the very process by which we choose our leaders. There was a heavy pause, the weight of her words sinking into the room. Crockett could feel the energy shift, the scrutiny now fully on Bezos. The billionaire sat motionless for a moment, his eyes scanning the papers, his breath shallow. He knew that the walls were closing in on him. He had built Amazon into an empire of unimaginable wealth and power, and yet now, in the face of undeniable truth, his carefully crafted world was beginning to crumble. But Crockett wasn't finished. She leaned forward, her voice unwavering as she addressed him directly. "Mr. Bezos, you've betrayed the trust of millions of people. Your company didn't just provide a service. It sold their most personal information to political campaigns. And those campaigns didn't just use that data to sell products. They used it to sell power. They used it to manipulate voters, to change the course of elections, all while you sat back and profited from the chaos you helped create." The room was electric with tension, the murmurs growing louder as the full impact of her statement began to hit. But Crockett wasn't done. She turned her full attention to Bezos, her eyes locked on his with an intensity that no amount of wealth or influence could shield him from. "This isn't just a corporate scandal, Mr. Bezos. This is a direct assault on the democratic process. You've used your platform to control the flow of information, to distort the truth, and to undermine the very foundation of our elections. And for what? For power? For profit?" Bezos shifted uncomfortably in his seat, but Crockett didn't give him a chance to respond. "You can sit there and claim that Amazon is a platform, that it's neutral, but we both know the truth. You have turned Amazon into a tool for political manipulation, and in doing so, you've compromised everything this country stands for." The tension in the room was palpable. Every eye was on Bezos now, the walls closing in. Crockett had laid bare the corruption at the heart of Amazon, exposing how the company's reach went far beyond retail. It had seeped into the very fabric of politics, manipulating the system to serve the interests of the few at the expense of the many. Crockett's voice rang out, sharp and resolute. "You traded ethics for power. You traded the public's trust for personal gain. And now, you must answer for it." The tension in the room was palpable as the weight of Crockett's accusations hung thick in the air. Bezos, who had spent years at the top of the corporate world, leaned back in his chair with a slow, deliberate motion. The papers that Crockett had placed before him were a direct challenge to everything he had built, and for the briefest moment, he seemed to hesitate. But that moment passed quickly, replaced by the steely calm that had gotten him to where he was. He wasn't going to let a politician, especially one like Crockett, shake his foundation. "Let me be perfectly clear," Bezos began, his voice unwavering, though there was an edge of frustration beginning to creep into his tone. He adjusted his suit slightly, an unconscious gesture that betrayed his attempt to maintain control. "Amazon is a platform. It's a tool that serves millions of people every day. It connects buyers and sellers, creators and consumers. And as a company, we do not engage in political interference. We are simply a marketplace, and we have always operated within the law." He paused for a moment, making sure everyone in the room was listening, ensuring that his words would have maximum impact. "The allegations you've thrown at us are baseless and nothing more than an attempt to distort the nature of our work." He exhaled slowly, clearly attempting to project an image of confidence, but there was a slight tightness in his jaw that Crockett couldn't ignore. His fingers tapped rhythmically on the table, as if searching for something to steady himself. "What you and others fail to understand," he continued, his voice now carrying a bit more force, "is that Amazon is built on the principles of freedom, the freedom of people to access information, to buy and sell freely. And just as you defend your right to speak your mind, I defend the right of companies like Amazon to operate without undue interference from government or individuals who misunderstand the mechanics of business. Bezos's words rang out, filled with the rhetoric of corporate defense that he had repeated countless times. But to Crockett, they sounded like empty justifications from a man who had long evaded real accountability. You speak of regulation, of fairness, Bezos said, his eyes narrowing slightly. But that's where your understanding falters. You want to control what we do, how we grow, how we operate, without understanding the very fundamentals of what makes these companies so successful. You're a politician, congresswoman, and you can't possibly grasp the intricacies of running a business on this scale. You're concerned with ideals, with optics, but what you fail to see is the bigger picture, the one that keeps the economy running, the one that creates jobs, opportunity, and yes, wealth for millions of people. The room shifted uneasily as Bezos finished his tirade. The conservative members who had been silent up until now nodded approvingly, their expressions betraying their loyalty to Bezos and his message. Crockett could feel their eyes on her, the weight of their support for Bezos amplifying the sense of injustice she already felt. Here they were, these men who had been bought and paid for by corporate giants like Bezos, agreeing with his narrative of unchecked corporate freedom. They wouldn't, see the harm in Bezos's empire. They were blind to the lives Amazon had affected, the communities it had shattered in its relentless pursuit of growth. Crockett clenched her fist beneath the table, but she didn't flinch. She was well aware of the trap Bezos was trying to set, making her look like an idealistic fool who didn't understand the real world of big business. He was trying to paint her as a politician who cared more about abstract principles than the gritty realities of economics. But she wouldn't let him get away with it. "Mr. Bezos," Crockett said, her voice steady and cutting through the charged atmosphere, "you talk about freedom, about opportunity, but your freedom comes at the expense of the very people you claim to serve. Amazon doesn't just operate within the law, it manipulates the law to its benefit. You've used your position to influence politics, to shift the balance of power in your favor, and you've done it while hiding behind the guise of freedom. This isn't just about business, Mr. Bezos. This is about exploitation. This is about your unchecked power." Bezos's eyes flickered for just a second. There it was, the briefest crack in his armor. But he recovered quickly, his lips curling into a faint, almost dismissive smile. "You still don't get it, do you?" he said, his voice taking on a condescending edge. "You're a politician. You see things in black and white. But the world doesn't work that way. Business isn't about ideals. It's about creating value. It's about building something that lasts. And yes, that requires making tough decisions. You wouldn't understand." Those last words struck like a punch to the gut. He was dismissing her, not just as a politician, but as a person. His arrogance was palpable. The way he reduced her, reduced anyone who didn't share his worldview, to something smaller, less capable of comprehending the greatness of what he had achieved. And that was the moment Crockett knew. She wasn't just fighting against Bezos's influence. She was fighting against a system that had allowed men like him to thrive at the expense of the very values that had built this country. Her voice grew firmer, the words clearer and sharper with every syllable. "I understand just fine, Mr. Bezos. I understand perfectly that your idea of freedom is about protecting your own wealth and power, not the people you've left behind. You call it business. I call it exploitation." The room was now a pressure cooker, the air thick with the conflict between them. Bezos had dismissed her, underestimated her, but Crockett wasn't backing down. Not now, not ever. The truth was on her side, and that was something no amount of corporate power could erase. Just as Bezos finished his defense, the room hung in the air, thick with his calculated words. He had made his case, asserting that Amazon was nothing more than a neutral platform, a service to the people. The tension between the committee members and the billionaire was palpable. But before anyone could respond, an unexpected voice cut through the charged silence. The man who walked in was Thomas Mills, a former senior data analyst at Amazon. For years, Mills had been a quiet observer, a cog in the machine that powered Bezos's empire. But now, standing in front of the committee, he was something else. He was the voice of the truth, the one who had seen behind the curtain and knew the full extent of what Amazon had been hiding. Mills paused for a moment, his eyes scanning the room, taking in the faces of those who had trusted Bezos's word, before finally speaking. His voice was calm, but there was a weight behind it that sent a shiver through the room. "I used to work for Amazon," he began, his words simple, yet they felt like an earthquake in the room. "And in my time there, I witnessed things that I cannot stay silent about anymore." A low murmur spread through the room as Mills continued, his eyes now focused on Bezos. "What you don't understand," he said, his voice steady, "is that Amazon wasn't just collecting data on users. It wasn't just building algorithms to improve shopping. Amazon was using that data to manipulate public opinion, to influence political campaigns, to push a political agenda, and all of it was under the direction of Jeff Bezos." The room fell completely silent. The weight of his words was enough to send shockwaves through the committee, the press, and everyone watching. Mills didn't pause as the murmurs of disbelief and shock echoed around him. He had already said the unthinkable, and there was no going back now. "It wasn't just a few isolated incidents," Mills continued, his voice now gaining in strength. "Amazon wasn't just a passive player. It actively used its massive data to target voters, to sway political outcomes, and yes, to manipulate elections. Amazon knew exactly what it was doing. Bezos knew exactly what it was doing. This wasn't a mistake. This was part of a carefully calculated strategy." Mills's words hit harder than any argument Crockett had made. He wasn't just a whistleblower. He was a man who had seen the inner workings of Amazon's massive engine. A man who had witnessed firsthand how the company had bent the rules, ignored the public's trust, and used its vast influence for personal and political gain. Bezos, the titan of tech, the man who had spent decades building his empire, was now standing in the middle of the courtroom, exposed. As Mills spoke, Crockett felt the surge of justice swell within her. This was the evidence she had been waiting for, the moment that would change everything. Mills wasn't just revealing data, he was revealing the corruption at the very heart of Bezos's empire. His testimony was a slap to the face of everything Bezos had tried to protect, a direct challenge to the billionaire's carefully maintained illusion of righteousness. Bezos's face had turned a shade paler, but he still held his composure, though it was clear that Mills's words had shaken him. For the first time, Crockett saw a crack in his armor. The confidence that had defined Bezos, the smugness with which he had brushed off her accusations, was beginning to erode. But he was not going down without a fight. Mills's eyes never left Bezos as he delivered the final blow. "This wasn't just about business, Mr. Bezos," he said, his voice tinged with disgust. "This was about power. You used Amazon not just to dominate the market, but to manipulate the political process, to shape the outcomes of elections, to protect your own interests. And you did it all while hiding behind the facade of corporate neutrality, claiming that Amazon was just a platform." Mills turned to address the committee now, his face a mixture of resolve and anger. The American people deserve better than this. They deserve transparency. They deserve a system that isn't controlled by corporations who can manipulate their way into power. And it's time for Jeff Bezos to answer for what he's done. The room was filled with shock and disbelief. The accusations were no longer just allegations. They were coming from someone who had been inside the machine, someone who had seen it all. Crockett could feel the weight of the moment settling in. This wasn't just a courtroom drama. This was a battle for the very soul of democracy, and for the first time, the truth was on their side. The room was thick with the heavy weight of Thomas Mills' testimony. Bezos's carefully built defense was crumbling under the force of undeniable facts. The energy in the room shifted. The billionaire, once sitting comfortably at the helm of one of the world's most powerful corporations, was now exposed, and there was nowhere to hide. Crockett could feel the momentum building. This was the moment she had been waiting for, the moment she could take the fight to Bezos, not just as a representative of the people, but as their voice, demanding accountability. The injustice was clear. The stakes couldn't be higher, and now was her time to act. She stood tall, her heart pounding, her mind clear. The time for quiet politeness was over. Crockett's voice broke the silence, strong and unwavering. "Mr. Bezos, You've spent this entire hearing pretending that Amazon is some neutral platform, that your company is merely an entity providing a service for consumers. But the reality is far different. Her words echoed in the tense air, biting with truth. You have used your immense power not just to innovate and grow your business, but to manipulate it for your own interests. And in doing so, you've hurt not only Amazon, but the very democratic principles that this country was founded on. Bezos' face hardened as he leaned forward slightly, his fingers tapping on the table in a rhythmic motion, an attempt to maintain control. But Crockett wasn't backing down. Her eyes locked onto his, unwavering as she pressed forward with the undeniable force of her words. You've built an empire, yes, but you've done so at the expense of ethical values. The very trust that millions of customers placed in Amazon has been violated by you, Mr. Bezos. And in your pursuit of power, you've undermined the integrity of the political system that has been the foundation of this nation. Her words stung like fire, each one cutting through the carefully crafted image Bezos had spent years building. Crockett wasn't just speaking about business ethics. She was speaking about the trust between the people and the corporations that serve them. You've turned Amazon into more than just a marketplace, she continued, her voice steady but filled with conviction. You've turned it into a political tool, manipulating information, selling data to political campaigns, and altering the very course of our elections. You've used Amazon's reach to push your own agenda, without regard for the damage it's caused. The American people deserve more than this. The room was silent, the tension building as her words hung in the air. Bezos's face remained stoic, but Crockett could see the flicker of discomfort in his eyes. She could feel the weight of the moment settling in. She wasn't just questioning his actions. She was challenging the entire system that had allowed him to operate unchecked for so long. She could see the growing unease in the committee members, the realization that Bezos, the tech mogul, might not be the hero they had once imagined him to be. This is not about free enterprise, Mr. Bezos, Crockett pressed, her voice rising, filled with the righteousness of her cause. This is about responsibility. This is about accountability. You've let your empire grow unchecked, and in doing so, you've sacrificed the values that are supposed to guide not just business, but society itself. The American people put their trust in companies like yours, and you've abused that trust for personal gain. She paused, letting the weight of her words settle before delivering the final blow. It's time for you to be held accountable for your actions. You have to answer to the people who trusted you. I'm not just asking for an apology, Mr. Bezos. I'm demanding that you take responsibility. You must publicly apologize to the American people for the harm you've caused. And you must promise that Amazon will never again use its power to manipulate the political process. The people deserve that, and they deserve it now. Crockett's voice was unwavering, her eyes fierce with the fire of justice. The room, once filled with murmurs and shifting eyes, was now deadly silent. Crockett had spoken with such clarity, such force, that even the powerful Bezos found himself momentarily shaken. The air in the room felt thick, the battle lines drawn clearly. This wasn't just about a corporate giant. This was about restoring faith in a system that had been bent and twisted for too long. Crockett had thrown down the gauntlet, and the weight of her words left no room for escape. For the first time, Bezos was truly cornered, and the truth that had been hidden for so long was finally in the light. The injustice, the abuse of power, the disregard for the people, it was all laid bare, and now it was up to him to answer. Bezos sat back in his chair, his posture rigid, the weight of Crockett's accusations still hanging in the air like a storm cloud. The room had gone silent, every eye on him as he prepared to respond. The initial discomfort had passed, replaced by a sharp focus. He had been in moments like this before, facing public scrutiny, but this time felt different. This wasn't just a corporate challenge, it was a personal one. Crockett's words had shaken him, but he wasn't about to let her define the narrative. Not today. With a steady breath, he leaned forward, his eyes narrowing slightly as he met her gaze. His voice, when it came, was cold and controlled. "Let's be clear about one thing, Congresswoman," he began, his words deliberate, calculated. "I'm not the only one in this room with power. You want to talk about influence? Let's talk about the power you and your colleagues wield every single day. The political influence you all have is every bit as formidable as Amazon's. But you don't hear me accusing you of corruption, do you? He paused, letting the implication hang in the air. Amazon is a platform. We provide a service. We connect people. We create jobs. We innovate. We don't manipulate. We operate legally. Every single action we take is within the bounds of the law. He leaned back in his chair, his expression now more dismissive than defensive. What you don't seem to understand, Congresswoman, is that businesses like Amazon are not the problem. The problem lies in the fact that you want to control us. You want to regulate us. You want to silence the free market. You can't seem to grasp that Amazon is here because of the freedom we have to grow, to expand, to innovate. You can't impose rules on a company like mine without destroying the very foundation that allows it to exist in the first place. The words were sharp, and Bezos knew they would cut. But he was playing a game of perception now, trying to shift the narrative. He was positioning himself not just as a businessman, but as a defender of a greater cause. What you're asking for, he continued, his voice rising slightly, is the destruction of innovation. You want to take away our freedom, our ability to act. You want to control how we do business. And in doing so, you destroy the very thing that makes America what it is, a country of free enterprise, of personal liberty. He paused, his gaze sweeping the room to gauge the reactions. Some committee members, mostly conservatives, were nodding in agreement, their expressions mirroring his disdain for government intervention. Crockett's words, so carefully crafted and laced with accusation, seemed to be falling on deaf ears. Bezos felt a wave of triumph, believing that he had just won the battle. He wasn't just defending his company, he was defending an ideology. Turning back to Crockett, Bezos's expression shifted, his lips curling slightly. You're a politician, Congresswoman. You don't understand the complexities of running a business at this scale. You've never had to make the hard decisions, to navigate the pressures of global markets and international competition. You're too focused on your own narrow view, unable to see the bigger picture. You want to regulate everything because you don't have the vision to understand what it takes to build something like Amazon. The words were meant to sting, to deflate her argument, to strip away any authority she might have gained from her position. To Bezos, Crockett was nothing more than an idealistic figure, too small, too naive, to understand the complexities of the world he inhabited. It was the perfect deflection, designed to make her feel small and out of her depth, to push her back into her political corner. You stand here, attacking a company that has done more to innovate, to grow, and to provide opportunity than any other company in history, he continued, his voice dripping with disdain. And what do you offer in return? Bureaucratic red tape and a misguided sense of moral superiority. You're a politician who's lost sight of what truly drives progress: freedom. Freedom for businesses to grow, for individuals to succeed without being weighed down by government control. You don't understand what it takes to make the tough calls that create real change. You're too busy playing politics. Crockett, her fist clenched beneath the table, could feel the sting of his words. He was attempting to belittle her, to paint her as a well-meaning but hopelessly out-of-touch politician. But Crockett wasn't about to let him control the conversation. She knew the stakes were higher than his self-serving arguments about free market principles. Bezos, in his attempt to deflect and disparage her, had just exposed the very thing she had been fighting against: the unchecked power of corporations and their ability to manipulate the system for their own gain. His smirk was the final insult. Bezos had reduced the issue to a matter of personal freedom, as if his empire's unchecked growth and influence were a natural and inevitable consequence of progress. But Crockett wasn't fooled. She saw beyond the rhetoric, beyond the polished words designed to mask the damage caused by his corporate empire. To her, it wasn't about limiting freedom, it was about restoring balance, about ensuring that corporations like Amazon didn't control the very foundation of American democracy. The injustice was clear. Bezos had made his billions on the backs of ordinary people, and now he stood there, defending his right to control, to manipulate, to dominate. And Crockett would not stand by while he tried to erase the damage he had caused. The fight for accountability was just beginning. The explosive accusations Crockett had made during the hearing didn't just rattle Bezos. They set off a chain reaction that rippled far beyond the walls of the committee room. The moment the hearing broke for recess, the media machines kicked into high gear. News outlets scrambled to cover the latest bombshell. Amazon, the global behemoth that had revolutionized the way people shopped, was now accused of manipulating political campaigns and undermining the democratic process. The stories flooded the front pages, each headline a hammer strike against Bezos's empire, and each one more damning than the last. But the media wasn't the only force reacting to Crockett's words. As the story gained traction, social media exploded. Tweets and Facebook posts from ordinary citizens, political commentators, and activists alike began to flood the platforms with outrage. The hashtag number Bezos manipulates began trending, with thousands of people sharing articles, personal opinions, and impassioned pleas for justice. People from all walks of life voiced their anger, disgust, and disbelief at the scope of the allegations. Amazon had once been a symbol of modern efficiency, the company everyone turned to for convenience. But now it was synonymous with corruption and power abuse. The online outrage was palpable, with viral videos and memes mocking Bezos, painting him as the villain in a story of corporate greed and political manipulation. Some called him the king of data, others, more bitterly, the puppet master, who had pulled the strings behind the scenes of political campaigns. What began as a few voices in a public hearing was quickly turning into a public outcry of mass proportions. Amazon is a tool of political control. Stop Bezos before he controls everything. One tweet read, swiftly shared and retweeted thousands of times. Another post read, "What happened to democracy? How did we let a corporation dictate our elections?" Every major platform was rife with condemnation, and the public was just beginning to understand the full extent of the issue. People were no longer asking, "Is this possible?" They were asking, "How could we have allowed this to happen?" As the public reaction grew louder, the pressure on lawmakers to act became undeniable. The momentum shifted rapidly, and soon calls for legal action against Amazon were everywhere. Public petitions emerged, gaining hundreds of thousands of signatures within hours, demanding that Amazon be investigated for its role in political manipulation. It wasn't just the media or a few outspoken politicians anymore. It was the people, rising up in unison, demanding accountability for corporate abuse. Across the country, the outcry was almost deafening. People in small towns, big cities, and even rural communities were now focused on the same issue. A new rallying cry had emerged: "We demand justice for the American people." Signs, banners, and digital ads began appearing everywhere, demanding an investigation into Amazon's practices. The public was angry, and rightfully so. How had a company so deeply embedded in American life, a company trusted by millions, been allowed to manipulate the very system that was meant to protect the people? And it wasn't just the grassroots activists who were taking a stand. High-profile figures from across the political spectrum began voicing their support for Crockett's claims. Politicians, some from the conservative side, others from the liberal wing, united under the banner of justice. They saw this as more than just a political issue. It was about restoring faith in a system that had been eroded by unchecked corporate power. One former senator even took to social media to write, "This is a wake-up call for all of us. The power of corporations to influence politics has gone too far. We must act now." The calls for legal action were growing louder by the hour. The pressure on the government, on the Department of Justice, to launch an investigation into Amazon's practices was becoming impossible to ignore. People from all over the nation began to demand that Amazon be held accountable, not just for manipulating political outcomes, but for eroding the very fabric of democracy. The question was no longer whether action would be taken, it was when and how. Within 48 hours, lawmakers were drafting new legislation aimed at investigating tech companies and their involvement in political manipulation. The committee that Crockett had appeared before was already setting up additional hearings, and subpoenas were being issued. The federal government was on the move, but it was clear that the path forward wouldn't be easy. Bezos, who had long been untouchable, was now the center of a storm that threatened to engulf him. As the situation escalated, Crockett found herself at the forefront of this movement. She had known the battle wouldn't be easy, but she hadn't anticipated the sheer scale of the public outcry that would follow. People were not just reacting, they were demanding change. The sense of injustice that had simmered beneath the surface for so long had finally boiled over, and the call for corporate accountability was louder than ever before. The pressure on Bezos was now undeniable. In private meetings and behind closed doors, Amazon's executives scrambled to contain the fallout, but it was already too late. The genie was out of the bottle. Every corner of the media, from the most reputable outlets to social media influencers, was talking about the same thing: Bezos and Amazon's manipulation of the political process. Public sentiment had reached a boiling point. People were no longer willing to accept the corporate apologia that had long been the norm. The public wanted justice, and they wanted it now. The question wasn't if Bezos would face consequences, it was what those consequences would be. From the streets to the halls of power, everyone was talking about the same thing: accountability, change, justice. Crockett had sparked a fire, and now it was spreading uncontrollably. The fight for transparency, for fairness, had become a battle that could no longer be ignored. And as Crockett watched the wave of support for her cause swell across the nation, she knew this was just the beginning. The road ahead would be long, but she was ready. The people had spoken, and it was time for Bezos to answer. As the room buzzed with the lingering echoes of Bezos's defense, Crockett knew that the battle was far from over. Bezos had spoken with the polished arrogance of a man who had long been untouchable, cloaking his actions in the guise of freedom and business ethics. But the truth had already been laid bare, and now it was time for action. Crockett had come to this hearing prepared to expose the darkness behind Amazon's corporate empire, and now, with the weight of public opinion behind her, she was ready to push forward with the legal action that Bezos had tried so hard to avoid. She rose from her seat, her eyes burning with conviction. "Mr. Bezos," she began, her voice firm, commanding the room's attention, "you've spent this hearing defending your actions, claiming that Amazon operates within the law, that you've done nothing wrong. But we know the truth now. Amazon, under your leadership, has manipulated the very political system this country relies on. You've used your company's influence to sway elections, to distort public opinion, and to restrict access to information that is crucial for an informed democracy." The room was still, the weight of her words settling on everyone present. Crockett didn't allow herself to be distracted. She knew this moment was too important. "You've abused your power, Mr. Bezos, and you've done it at the expense of the American people. Your manipulation of data, your use of Amazon as a tool for political gain, it is an abuse of the trust that millions of people placed in your company, and that cannot stand." Bezos sat there, his hands steepled before him, eyes narrowing slightly as Crockett's accusations continued. She could see the flicker of unease in his expression. Though he still tried to maintain the air of confidence, his guard was clearly slipping. This wasn't just another round of corporate defense. This was the moment where Crockett would demand accountability for the system that had allowed Bezos to run unchecked for so long. "I am calling for an official investigation into Amazon's involvement in political manipulation," Crockett declared, her voice rising in intensity. "This cannot be allowed to continue. It's not enough to point to your free market defense or hide behind vague legalities. The American people deserve to know the truth, and they deserve to see justice served. The power you have abused must be held accountable." Her words landed like a drumbeat, steady and unyielding. It wasn't just a call to action, it was a demand for justice. The atmosphere in the room shifted, a palpable sense of gravity settling over the proceedings. Crockett wasn't just questioning Bezos anymore. She was challenging the very system that had allowed him and others like him to operate with impunity. She was calling for a reckoning. As the tension in the room built, Crockett turned her gaze toward the committee members. "The American people have been manipulated by corporate interests for too long," she said, her eyes scanning the room. "And it's time for us to take a stand. We need to launch a full-scale investigation into Amazon's actions to ensure that no company, no individual is above the law. We must hold Bezos accountable for his actions and make it clear that the manipulation of our democracy will not be tolerated." Her words were like a rallying cry, the force of her conviction impossible to ignore. She could see the gears turning in the committee members' minds. Some were already nodding in agreement, while others, still loyal to Bezos and his vision of corporate freedom, shifted uncomfortably in their seats. But Crockett knew this moment was bigger than one man, one company. It was about restoring trust in the system, about proving to the American people that their government could still stand up to those who sought to abuse their power. Mr. Bezos, Crockett continued, her voice unwavering, you have manipulated data, influenced elections, and restricted the flow of information for your own gain. And now you will face the consequences. It's time for you to be held legally accountable for the harm you've caused, for the trust you've broken. You cannot continue to hide behind the facade of business as usual. The law applies to everyone, even you. Bezos' face hardened, his jaw clenched as he took in her words. He had been cornered, exposed, and now the full force of the legal system was beginning to bear down on him. The idea that he might actually be forced to answer for his actions, to be held responsible for the empire he had so carefully constructed, was something he had never fully considered. But now, with Crockett's call for an official investigation hanging in the air, the walls were closing in. He opened his mouth to respond, but Crockett wasn't finished. She wasn't going to let him sidestep the consequences any longer. This is not just about you, Mr. Bezos. This is about the millions of people who trusted Amazon with their personal data, with their privacy, and with their votes. This is about a system that has allowed corporate giants like you to manipulate the very core of our democracy for your own benefit. It's time for that to end. She paused, letting the weight of her words sink in before delivering the final blow. You will be held accountable, not just by this committee, but by the American people, and I will not stop until you are. You will answer for the damage you've done, and you will make amends for the harm you've caused. This is not the end, Mr. Bezos. This is just the beginning. With that, Crockett stood tall, her presence commanding the room. She had set the stage for the legal battle ahead, the battle that would force Bezos to confront the consequences of his actions. But as she stood there, she knew that this was just the first step. The investigation was only beginning, and the fight for justice had only just started. But the power of the people was on her side, and she wasn't going to back down. The road ahead would be difficult, but she was ready. Bezos would face the consequences for what he had done, and this time, he would have no way out. The days following Crockett's impassioned call for action were filled with a frenzied rush of media coverage, legal teams scrambling, and public outrage that seemed to gain momentum by the hour. The sheer scale of the fallout from Bezos' actions had set off a firestorm, and now the inevitable had come. Action was being taken. The long-awaited legal proceedings reached a boiling point, and the fate of Amazon hung in the balance. The tension in the room was unbearable as the judge, having heard all the evidence and deliberated over the consequences, prepared to issue a ruling. Crockett stood in the back of the courtroom, her eyes fixed on the judge as the final decision was announced. The room fell silent, all attention directed toward the moment that would decide Amazon's future. The air was thick with anticipation, the weight of the past weeks pressing on everyone. The judge's voice echoed through the courtroom as he declared the decision. In light of the evidence presented, Amazon is hereby ordered to pay a massive fine for its unlawful interference in the political process, its violation of privacy, and the ethical breaches it has committed over the years. Furthermore, the company will undergo a complete restructuring, with new oversight measures put in place to ensure that such misconduct will not occur again. A ripple of shock and disbelief moved through the room. Crockett allowed herself the smallest of smiles as the judge's words sunk in. The colossal fine was unprecedented, a signal that the justice system was willing to take a stand against the unchecked power of corporate giants. But it wasn't just the financial penalty that resonated. It was the mandatory restructuring of Amazon, the company that had operated without oversight, without accountability for so long. The court's decision wasn't just a victory for Crockett, it was a victory for the American people, for anyone who had ever been crushed under the weight of corporate power. Bezos, sitting at the defendant's table, had grown visibly pale. For a moment, he seemed to be in disbelief, his eyes wide, his fingers twitching with frustration. The reality of the judgment was beginning to settle in, and for the first time in years, he looked like a man who had lost control. It was no longer about business or profits. It was about the devastating consequences of his actions. The ruling meant that Bezos would no longer hold the same power he once did. His grip on Amazon, once unshakable, was now compromised. The judge's words were final. Bezos would lose control of key projects, and a new board would be established to oversee Amazon's operations. Bezos had used Amazon's platform for his own benefit, and now the consequences were clear. He would no longer be the sole architect of Amazon's future. His legacy, so carefully crafted over the years, was now tainted, and his influence over the company was being stripped away. The man who had once been invincible was now facing the fallout of his greed and disregard for the greater good. Crockett stood tall, her heart pounding with a mixture of triumph and relief. This was what justice looked like. It wasn't about vengeance, it was about accountability. She had fought tooth and nail to expose the truth, to challenge the forces that had allowed Bezos to operate above the law. And now that fight had culminated in a victory. Amazon would be forced to change, forced to answer for its actions. It wasn't just a personal victory for her. It was a victory for every person who had ever felt powerless in the face of corporate corruption. As the court session drew to a close, the room erupted in a mix of applause and murmurs. The world was watching, and Crockett knew that the decision would send shockwaves through the halls of power. But she wasn't done yet. This was just one victory in a much larger battle. As the media descended upon the courtroom, microphones thrust in her face, cameras flashing, Crockett turned to face the room, her voice steady and resolute. "This is just the beginning," she said, her voice clear and strong, cutting through the noise. "Amazon's punishment is only a small part of what needs to be done. This is about more than one company. This is about a system that has allowed corporations to exploit and manipulate the very foundation of our democracy. Today, we took a stand against that. But tomorrow, we fight to ensure that no corporation, no individual, is above the law." Her words echoed in the room, a powerful call to action for anyone willing to listen. She wasn't finished. The battle for justice was far from over, and she knew it. The fight for accountability would continue, not just against Amazon, but against all the forces that sought to distort and manipulate the system for personal gain. But for now, this victory was hers, and it was a victory for the people, for the American public who had been victimized by the unchecked power of corporations like Amazon. As she walked out of the courtroom, her shoulders squared with determination, Crockett knew that her journey wasn't over. This was the fight of her life, and she wasn't going to stop until the system was changed, until those who had abused their power were held accountable. Today had been a victory, but tomorrow the battle would continue. And she would be there, standing tall, fighting for the justice that so many had been denied for so long. As the final ruling was delivered and the weight of the courtroom began to settle, a quiet realization crept into the hearts of those who had witnessed the events unfold. For Crockett, standing on the precipice of victory, the true meaning of her fight began to sink in. This wasn't just about Amazon or Bezos or the specifics of a corporate scandal. It was about something deeper. It was about the power of the people, the power of justice, and the fight against a system that had been rigged for far too long. The true lesson from this story, as Crockett knew all too well, was that power, whether corporate or political, must always be held accountable. Bezos, for all his wealth and influence, had built his empire on the exploitation of the very people who trusted him. He had used his power to manipulate, to control, to shape the political landscape to his benefit, all while cloaking himself in the guise of a benevolent businessman. Crockett's victory was more than just a legal triumph. It was a resounding message to anyone who thought they were above the law. No one is untouchable, but the lesson wasn't just for Bezos. It was for all of us. For too long, we've lived in a world where the rich and powerful can operate without consequence, where corporate giants can sway elections, manipulate data, and control the flow of information without oversight. The fight for justice isn't just about exposing corruption in a single corporation. It's about rebalancing a system that is tilted too far in favor of the few and leaving the many behind. For Crockett, this victory was a beacon of hope, But it was also a reminder of the hard road ahead. The battle for fairness, for justice, would never be easy. She had faced personal attacks, ridicule, and the overwhelming influence of those with vast resources. But through it all, she had remained resolute in her commitment to the people. She understood that the real fight wasn't won in the courtroom. It was won in the hearts and minds of the public. It was won in the quiet moments when everyday people stood up and said, "Enough." The injustice that Crockett had faced was the same injustice that millions of people felt every day, whether they were at the mercy of corporate greed or political manipulation. And in that moment, as she stood before the crowd, the lesson was clear. It is not enough to simply expose corruption. We must demand change, not just from those at the top, but from the systems that allow them to thrive unchecked. We must not only speak the truth, but act upon it, no matter the cost. Her victory was a testament to the resilience of one individual's fight against a corrupt system, but it also highlighted the power of collective action. People had rallied around her cause, not because she was a politician, but because she was fighting for them. She was fighting for the countless voices that had been silenced for too long, for the people whose trust had been exploited by those with the means to manipulate and control. In the end, it wasn't about one woman or one company. It was about the people who believed in the possibility of a better world, a world where justice could prevail. The echoes of her words in the courtroom were a rallying cry for anyone who had ever felt powerless. It was a call to arms, a reminder that no matter how deep the corruption runs, there will always be those who are willing to stand up and fight. Crockett had shown that even in the face of overwhelming odds, the power of truth, the power of justice, and the power of the people could not be silenced. As she stood there, knowing that her journey was far from over, the lesson was clear. Change doesn't come from waiting. It comes from action. And no matter how impossible the odds may seem, standing up for what's right is the only way to make a difference. In that moment, as the room slowly emptied, Crockett's resolve hardened. She had already won the first battle, but the war for justice was far from over. And with the strength of the people behind her, she would continue to fight, not just for herself, but for a society that demanded fairness, transparency, and accountability from those in power. It was no longer about the fight for one person's reputation. It was about restoring the integrity of an entire system, a system that, for too long, had been abused by those who thought they could escape the consequences of their actions. The world had seen the power of one person standing against the odds. The real question now was, what would the world do with that power? The answer was simple. The fight for justice had only just begun, and no one was going to stop it. As the final ruling echoed through the courtroom, the gravity of what had just transpired hit Crockett like a wave. Bezos, once the untouchable titan of Amazon, had been forced to pay the price for his manipulation of the system, his abuse of power laid bare for all to see. Yet as she stood there, watching the consequences unfold, Crockett knew that this victory was not the end. It was only the beginning. The lesson of this moment was not just about holding one person accountable for their actions. It was about exposing the deep-rooted injustices within the system that allowed men like Bezos to thrive unchecked, to use their wealth and power to bend the rules to their favor. For too long, corporate giants like Amazon had operated with impunity, manipulating the very structures of democracy for their benefit. And for too long, the voices of those who fought for justice had been silenced or dismissed as idealistic or naive. But now Crockett had proven that even the most powerful could be held accountable. She had stood firm in the face of adversity, pushed back against the overwhelming tide of corporate influence, and made her voice heard when it mattered most. The victory wasn't just hers, it was a victory for every person who had ever felt powerless in the face of corporate greed, for every person who had watched as the system worked against them. The lesson that had become clear to Crockett through her battle was that no one, no matter how powerful, was above the law. The truth had the power to dismantle the walls of corruption, to expose the manipulation, and to bring about change. But that change wasn't easy. It required courage, persistence, and an unshakable belief in what was right. Crockett had faced unimaginable obstacles: political opponents, media scrutiny, personal attacks. But she had pressed on because she knew that justice wasn't a luxury for the few, but a necessity for the many. Bezos had tried to deflect, to hide behind his corporate defenses, but Crockett had refused to let him. She had shown the world that even the most powerful figures could be challenged, and that the pursuit of justice was worth any cost. The fight wasn't just about one company, it was about the people, about restoring trust in a system that had been warped by corporate interests. It was about giving a voice to those who had been ignored, exploited, and silenced. As she stood at the podium, Crockett realized that this moment would be remembered as a turning point, not just in her career, but in the broader fight for corporate accountability. It wasn't just about winning a legal case. It was about proving that the will of the people could overcome the grip of the powerful. She knew the road ahead would be long, and the challenges would continue, but the message had been sent. No one was above the law, and no matter how entrenched the system seemed, change was possible. Her fight wasn't over, and Crockett wouldn't stop. She would continue to stand up for justice, for fairness, and for a system that worked for everyone, not just the wealthy and powerful. The victory had proven that one person's voice could make a difference, and she would carry that lesson with her, pushing forward, relentless in her pursuit of a more just world. This was just the beginning of the fight for what was right, and she would not stop until the work was done. Thank you for watching until this moment and for standing with us on this journey for justice. Your support means everything. Like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss what's next. And we'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below and let us know what moved you most in this story. Together, our voices make a difference.